So I want you to imagine that you're on the International Space Station. This is actually a live feed of what is seen from the International Space Station right now. So you're on the International Space Station and you're in, I don't know, what's the size of maybe a large house floating above the Earth. Imagine if your roommates were Russians. And I mean Russians that are very Russian. Those Westerns are Nazis and pro Donetsk People's Republic and that kind of thing. That's what astronauts are experiencing right now. Now, it wasn't always that way, but there was this fascinating article that I saw just the other day. It said this: it's like doing an Arctic expedition with German scientists in 1943. Life on the International Space Station at a time of war. And so these International Space Station astronauts from Russia and the West share a craft the size of a large family home. That's what we want to talk about here. So I want to roll back the clock a little bit, and just before the war, you saw this. In fact, the date of this is fascinating. February 23rd, 2022. The day before, the day before the invasion. As you know, the invasion was February 24th, 2022, and this was published one day earlier. Here's what they had to say in an Associated Press
Way
piece.
through the hatchway into the Soyuz MS-17 spacecraft, and then closing the hatch.
The Russian Federation is a partner with ourselves, with the United States, Canada, Japan, and Europe aboard the International Space Station. They've been a partner since the 1990s. They can't operate without us. We can't operate without them. So it's truly an international partnership.
Yeah, tensions should not have a significant impact on US-Russia cooperation in space. Well, that's before the invasion.
The space station, as I said, has been largely isolated from other political events, but it's not invincible. It does exist in a larger context of U.S.-Russian relations. Given our mutual dependence, however, and given the good working relationship we have at the technical level, I don't see anything happening to the station in the near term, despite events on Earth.
Of course, that was one day before the invasion.
It's possible to imagine a break with Russia that would endanger the space station, but that would be at the level of dropping diplomatic relations. That would be something that would be an utterly last resort. And so I don't really see that happening unless there is a wider military confrontation.
And there is a pretty significant military confrontation. So here's the article. It's like doing Arctic expedition with German scientists in 1943. It's a 47-year-old former space shuttle pilot, then on his second visit to the space station, Gerdes had experienced for himself. He was sitting at the window with Alexander Samakutyev, a Russian cosmonaut who was also on his second visit to the space station. Both men had been military pilots in their countries. They spoke each other's languages. They exchanged Christmas presents. But at this point, the space station happened to be passing over eastern Ukraine. Down there was darkness punctuated by sudden red flashes. They were watching a war. Now imagine that. You're on the International Space Station with Russians looking over Ukraine, seeing the bombs burst in Ukraine with the naked eye. I'm not talking about with magnification. They could see it from space. We were watching people being killed by the Russian war from space, Wirtz tells me. We both looked at each other. It was a somber moment, but we didn't say a word. The fact that they're up there together at all makes Wirtz very angry. It's like partnering with German scientists in 1943 to go on an Arctic expedition, he says. That's basically what we're doing right now. His own relationship with his former Russian comrades have almost entirely collapsed. Last year, Samu Kodev, himself now a member of the Russian State Duma, was sanctioned by the UK and other Western nations. He has proved an active supporter of Vladimir Putin's invasion. It's a betrayal, says Wirtz, at the most profound level. In April this year, their Russian partners, Roscosmos, a state corporation, formally committed itself to continuing operation on the station until 2028, just 2 years before it's scheduled to be decommissioned. While the US and its allies are imposing the biggest sanctions package in the history on Russia, the space station remains immune, sanction-free zone. It's exempt. We'll come to why a little later. Meanwhile, this engineering marvel of laboratories and living quarters keeps orbiting the Earth at 10 times the speed of a rifle bullet, 16 times a day, every day, just as it has for the past quarter of a century, floating in a physical and some might say a moral vacuum high above the mess down there. 4 fresh crewmates, including a Russian and American, launched this morning and are expected to dock with the station tomorrow. Before that, there were 7 people inside, 3 Americans, 3 Russians, and 1 Emirati. This is United Arab Emirates. Okay, now, so that's what's going on from space, and this was a few days ago. This was last week, but Prigozhin's death in the plane crash actually kind of got in the way of doing this particular video. But I just want you to experience what emotions they're experiencing as they're up there, because politics of what's happening in Ukraine affects the whole world. In fact, it expands all the way to space. Their home is approximately the size of a 6-bedroom house with the separate living and working areas for the Russian and Americans. The Emirati bunks down with the latter, as all non-Russians do, linked by a corridor. How do they cope up there? How do they function when their countries are at loggerheads, or when Putin makes threats about waging nuclear war? Well, that's got to be awkward, right? Charles Bowden, a spry 77-year-old former astronaut and NASA's chief from 2009 till 2017, the space station, according to him, the space station exists to make all our lives better on Earth. The 16 pressured modules that today make up the station are designed around one central purpose: to be a permanently inhabited orbiting laboratory. Over the decades, thousands of experiments have been conducted in the unique conditions of microgravity. By the early 90s, the USSR had collapsed and Russia was in chaos, but the Russians knew about space stations. In the Soviet days, they had built 7 of them. President Clinton threw his weight behind the project, now rebranded as the International Space Station, claiming that by bringing in the Russians, he was helping their fledgling democracy. Quote, "We brought them in to stop them from behaving worse than they were behaving before." Okay, the Russians are like your crazy uncle who's maybe bipolar or an alcoholic or something along these lines, and we always have to tap dance around their bad behavior. And that's what we were doing here. We were bringing them in so that, well, they won't do worse things if we bring them in here. It was a case of keeping your friends close and your enemies closer. And they have this reputation with many countries around the world. The Russians bring the propulsion and altitude control to maintain orbit, as well as a fuel to feed those systems. The Americans look after the internal power and other systems. It's today a monster that on Earth would weigh almost the same as 2 Statues of Liberty. There are 5 space agencies involved, including ESA, which represents 22 countries. But here's what's happening. What if there's bad blood between the two, when you really need to be able to trust the people up there? Quote, "If you want a divorce," says Anatoly Zak, an independent Russian space reporter who now lives in the US, quote, "you can't do it without losing the space station," unquote. And if you lose the station, argues Bolden, you lose a crown jewel whose benefits to humanity are much greater than the relationship with any country. Says Gatens, the crews even drink each other's urine after it has been recycled. There's not a lot of places you can get water up there. It gets recycled with over 90% efficiency. Hoberg told reporters recently it actually tastes delicious. Okay, that's how close quarters these guys are. Okay, within hours of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Dmitry Rogozin, the rabble-rousing chief of Russia's space agency, and a man who once notoriously claimed that Alaska still belongs to Russia, okay, this is their head of the equivalent of NASA, okay, was threatening to crash the space station within hours of the war breaking out. Rogozin accused the U.S. president of suffering from Alzheimer's disease, tweeting that any blockings of cooperation could mean that the 500-ton space station might enter an uncontrolled deorbit and fall into the US or Europe. The ISS does not fly over Russia, so all the risks are yours. Are you ready for them? Unquote. What? Okay, so the political nonsense that's happening in Russia spilling into Ukraine is again, a worldwide problem that needs to be addressed, and it's even reaching to space. Fantastic as it seemed, Rogozin was threatening to pull the plug on the propulsion system that kept the spacecraft aloft and leave it to its fate. He's big, he's loud, he drinks a lot, says Wirtz, who met him while training in Russia. He's Putin squared. Hard to imagine, right? An extremist nationalist famous for making Hitler salutes. Okay. And so the provocations kept coming. 9 days after the invasion, a spoof video apparently created by Roscosmos appeared on Telegram, tagged with the logo of the Russian state-owned news agency RIA Novosti. In the heavily edited clip, a mix of real footage and CGI, 2 Russian cosmonauts were seen waving goodbye to their U.S. colleague Mark Vande Hey before climbing into a Russian segment, closing the hatches, and to the applause of Moscow's mission controllers, detaching the entire Russian portion from the rest of the space station, abandoning Vande Hey on board. It was a ludicrous and totally impractical scenario, but the video sparked an uproar in Western media as Vande Hey was due to return to Earth with his Russian colleagues just 3 weeks later, after nearly a year in space. Vande Hey's mother, Mary, described the whole thing as a terrible threat. Well, I would think so. I mean, they said that's a joke, but that's pretty ludicrous. Then in July, all 3 Russian cosmonauts on the station took selfies with the flags of the People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. Okay, well, that's not going to win friends and influence people that they have to work with. Roscosmos described the Russians' capture of the Luhansk region as, quote, a liberation day to celebrate both on Earth and in space. Nice. This is them. Okay, at which point NASA's patience finally snapped. The agency deplored the use of the ISS to support the war, reminding Rogozin that it was fundamentally inconsistent with the station's primary function, namely to advance science for peaceful purposes. 8 days later, Rogozin was fired. Only Putin is allowed to make brushfire statements, says Kathleen Lewis, curator of the International Space Programs at the Smithsonian Institution, and Rogozin out Putin. Like, you got to be and that's what Prigozhin was doing too, who just died just a few days ago. Prigozhin was out Putining Putin in his claims and his remarks and that sort of thing, and it didn't end well for Rogozhin. Rogozhin's replacement was Yuri Bazarov. And under a new seat-swapping arrangement, Russian cosmonauts would get a ride on one of Elon Musk's Crew Dragons, a cutting-edge spacecraft that had only begun operations in 2020. It would carry its first Russian, Anna Kalinka, to the space station in October of 2022. As for Rogozhin, he went on to spend the next few jobless months posing in military uniforms for his Telegram account before Ukrainian shell exploded on his 59th birthday party in December 2022 at a restaurant in Donetsk, seriously injuring him. So he's kind of off the stage. Says Berger, a lot of cosmonauts are very sympathetic to the war. Simonovic, Wirtz's former colleague, is not the only one to have been sanctioned. Many are products of the military, and they only hear one side of the story. And so that might be part of what's going on. They're not hearing how it's framed in the West in any way. They're only hearing the Russian framing. Some of them are completely brainwashed and out of their minds. It's just insane, claims Scott Kelly, former NASA Space Station commander who returned his Russian space medal in disgust after the invasion. Kelly now serves in the U.S. Congress. Last May, when Oleg Novetsky, a former fighter pilot and veteran of 3 ISS tours between 2012 and 2021, received the Order for Merit of the Fatherland from Putin himself. At all times, Novetsky declared, our enemies, mostly Western ones, have tried to seize our land and enslave our people. Wait, hold on a second. He's a Russian, saying that the West is trying to steal their lands and enslave their people while they're doing what they're doing to Ukraine. Just put that in context. He then offered to fight on the front line at the age of 51. So that's the kind of people that they're dealing with up in the space station. Also decorated was fellow cosmonaut Pyotr Dubarov, who proclaimed that today the masks are thrown off and Western Nazism has shown its true face to the world. Okay. It might come as a surprise to learn that Novetzky and Dubirov are those same dear friends with whom Vande High lived on the space station. And there are some cosmonauts who feel very differently about the war. They just won't tell you because it's too dangerous for them to talk like that. Every one of the 8 Western astronauts I spoke to has essentially stopped communicating with their Russian colleagues, or on very rare occasions that they do, never about politics. Apart from anything, it could put the Russians at risk. People are turning each other in, says Kelly. Like, you're in a place where your life might depend on being able to trust the other astronauts and cosmonauts up there, and this is how the Ukraine war has even poisoned outer space. Says DeWinnie, it's extremely stressful for our crews to be there in those circumstances. His German colleague, Matthias Maurer, who returned to Earth a month later, described seeing huge clouds of smokes over cities like Mariupol and rocket hits on Kyiv. We raised the issue very quickly and proactively. All 6-7 of us immediately agreed that it's a horrible situation. We were all shocked, the Russian colleagues, the American colleagues. Nobody could understand what was happening down there. The war is an elephant in the station. You literally rely on each other for your life, he says. Nor was this an isolated incident. With an ever-increasing amount of space junk and satellites in low orbit, the ISS has to maneuver to avoid collisions almost every year. Even Wirtz, who argues that continuing to allow Russians to fly on American spacecraft and vice versa is an outrage. Nevertheless, he accepts that things are different once you're up there. Politics is politics. We're not going to change politics, so let's just try not to die in the vacuum of space. Let's work together as a crew. Things got awkward when one cosmonaut, Alexander Servetskov, told Swanson his Russian brother had been thrown out of Ukraine. Over and again, he insisted that Ukrainians were Nazis and hooligans. Well, that's not going to work out very well if they're having those kinds of conversations, and they need to be able to get along. And then there's Mike Lopez Allegra, who has been an astronaut for longer than the ISS has existed. He flew on the space shuttle. He was up there for 15 days. Apart from noticing how much had changed since 2007, he said, quote, there seems to be stuff everywhere. It's just loaded with laptops and cables. He says he noted that none of the inhabitants, the 3 Americans, the 3 Russians, and now the German, mentioned the war. Whatever was going on wasn't going on, he says. It was as nothing like that was going on the planet. Meanwhile, the Russians were extraordinarily gracious. On their 2 Saturday nights, everyone went to watch movies. They had a dessert and Russian tea, and one of them, Oleg Artemev, gave them gifts, special cookies prepared by his wife. It was lovely, says Lopez. The Russians even let them use their own toilet when the American one broke. In fact, it broke down twice. Just 4 days after he departed on 24 April, 2 of those cosmonauts, Denis Matiev and Artemev of the homemade cookies, went on to unfurl that inflammatory Russian victory banner on their spacewalk. And all 3 cosmonauts posed that July with the flags of the Donetsk and Luhansk. So it kind of went south pretty quickly. Now, I can't imagine what they're experiencing up there in space, having to work together, having to be in the same place with this Ukraine war, everything that's going on, the politics of it, contaminating their relationships. But it's even unpleasant up in space. Now, I just thought that this was interesting because we think of the war as a regional conflict, and it is a regional conflict, but it's a regional conflict that has greater implications, and it has the ability to spread and potentially become a world war or a nuclear war or something larger. And that it's even contaminating how cosmonauts and astronauts are getting along in space is just unbelievable. Okay, I just wanted to share that with you so that you understood just how enormous this issue is. Thank you for your time. Thank you for listening to me. I'm curious about your thoughts. Thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine. I'll be back tomorrow, and I hope you will be too.